Hello everyone, this is Mine and Shade again, and this is the third session of my series Podcasts on Science and Rationality. The disease of nowadays philosophy and the social sciences is called relativism, especially global relativism. Now, what does global relativism postulate? According to global relativism, there is no absolute truth about anything at all. Instead, what is true depends on individuals and groups, such as families, friends, neighborhoods, regions, countries, and so on. Most famously, this thesis was forwarded by the philosophers Paul Feyerabend in his book Against Method Outline of an Anarchistic Theory of Knowledge, and Thomas Kuhn in his book The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. Even the otherwise respectable philosopher and mathematician Willard van Quine contributed to this theory. Of course, this is totally nonsense. There are, needless to say, propositions which are true independent of anyone's personal mind. The most stunning mistake the relativists make is to conclude from the fact that there are some propositions which cannot be objectively true that there are no propositions that can be true at all. The conclusion just doesn't follow from the premises. Let me render the argument in order to show you that the argument is even formally invalid, so that we can put it aside without further ado. An argument is formally invalid if the premises are true, but the conclusion is false. Otherwise, an argument is formally valid and needs to be considered with respect to its contents, that is, the actual claims, and can only be disproved by showing that there is something wrong in these concrete assertions. The argument's first premise is, as mentioned, that there are some propositions which cannot be objectively true. This premise is clearly true. The second premise of the argument is that it is thus logically possible that there are no propositions being true whatsoever. This premise is true too, for one can only dismiss the logical possibility of something if it leads to a logical contradiction. As the premise does not lead to a logical contradiction, this second premise is in fact true. The conclusion now is that there are actually no propositions which are objectively true at all. Overtly, this is false, since there are such propositions which are true independent of any views. If I or you did not exist, it would nevertheless be true that the Earth travels around the Sun, that the Earth spins around its own axis, and that the Moon is a trabant of the Earth. Needless to say, if there were no human beings, there would be no one to utter or think such propositions. However, the facts would be the same, even though no one would be able to state it as facts. There is no need for any identification of relationships among entities, notwithstanding that we do so when we describe what one object does in regard of another. The reason for this is that we are used to realize agents wherever possible. This is almost certainly a relic from our ancestors' evolution, for it surely helped them to survive better, and so gave them an advantage over others who lacked this ability. Not each thing in the world is an agent though, and this tends to confuse us. When we describe certain events, just as I described the Earth as traveling around the Sun, we often unconsciously imagine the objects involved as doing something. It should go without saying that they are not. This just takes place because of certain natural forces like gravitation. That is to say, events like the Earth traveling around the Sun are caused by natural forces which in their turn have no intentions, since they are the result of things being just the way they are. I could go into further detail now by discussing quantum physics and theory of relativity, yet that would lead into too complicated details. Let me just render one thing, which I think is important to know. According to quantum physics, no particle in the microcosmos has a determinate position in spacetime. So, How come we perceive macro objects which have determinate positions? The reason is this. In the microcosmos, each particle has its range of freedom, thus it could be in any places. However, the ranges of freedom of the particles overlap, so that we actually can perceive objects in the macrocosmos, the parts of which do not change their position all the time. It is another and far more difficult question whether each possible position of each particle in the microcosmos is realized in some way. To my knowledge, this question has no solution yet, but I think this is not relevant for the point I wish to make about relativism. The important point is that things can be true independent of anyone's view, even if there were no one to say so. As concerns Paul Feyerabend's and Thomas Kuhn's relativism of science, this is easy to debunk. Scientific theories and views have, needless to say, changed a lot over the centuries, particularly over the last decades. A lot, though, has not changed as dramatically as Feyerabend and Kuhn would have believed. Scientists try to combine theories, as they do with, for instance, the theory of relativity and quantum theory, instead of substituting one for the other. There is no such thing as a total shift of paradigm in the sense that new generations of scientists abandon with everything their former colleagues believed. Furthermore, we should not accept an absolute moral relativism. Many moral propositions are right or wrong according to determinate cultures, of course, yet if human beings unnecessarily take damage, the respective proposition is unacceptable as morally right. Thus, we can and must judge propositions as put forward by the Sharia, for instance, as morally wrong, just as we must deem it wrong to try to exterminate human beings just because they belong to a determinate group, as, for example, the National Socialists tried to exterminate the Jews in the Third Reich. Thank you very much for listening.